All right, it's 4 o'clock. Shall we get started? Okay, so my name is Sarah Christensen. I'm a librarian at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And READ is a collaboration between Champaign-Urbana area public and academic librarians that seeks to promote racial literacy and discussion, and also to encourage anti-racist activism and self-reflection. This is an ongoing project. We have about a year's worth of programming planned out so far, and hopefully we'll go beyond that as well. Please feel free to check out our website and social media channels for more information about upcoming events. I would like to thank the Urbana Free Library for hosting and the University of Illinois Library for support for this. I do have to mention that views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of READ partner libraries. This is going to be a discussion between our 5 fabulous panelists and moderated by Professor Glaude, who we are thrilled to have here. So just to introduce all the panelists, Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He is the former president of the American Academy of Religion, the largest professional organization of scholars of religion in the world. He is the author of a number of books, including Democracy in Black, and most recently, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. He is from Moss Point, Mississippi, a small town on the Gulf Coast, and is a graduate of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Professor Glaude is known to be a convener of conversations and debates, and you can follow him on Twitter at ESGlaude, and he also has a podcast, AAS21. And if you've been watching the news at all, you've probably seen him a lot. Erik McDuffie is an associate professor of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Born in Detroit and raised in suburban Cleveland, he is completing a book on Garveyism in the Midwest. Evelyn Reynolds is an associate professor of sociology at Parkland College in Champaign, Illinois. She has taught at Illinois State University, Illinois Central College, and Heartland Community College. Evelyn is an activist, formerly a lead organizer with the Black Lives Matter Global Network and founder of Black Lives Matter Champaign-Urbana. Kofi Bazzell-Smith is an artist, competitive boxer, and lecturer working in manga, Japanese-style comics. Kofi speaks Japanese and has studied manga in Japan twice. A US-Japan bridging scholar, Kofi lectures on storytelling and Japanese culture and uses his work to increase Black representation in the medium. His YouTube channel, Kofi Manga, teaches lessons on manga production and storytelling. And last but not least, Paloma Gonzalez is a 23-year-old Parkland graduate that has an interest in cultural anthropology and critical thought. She has been a member of social justice organizations at the University of Illinois. So I have just a question to get you started, and then I will let y'all take it from there. So Professor Glaude, I was hoping that you could kind of explain the idea of the lie described by Baldwin and also discussed throughout your book. And then within the context of that lie, what is the role of arts, literature, and scholarship today?
Well, first of all, let me just thank everyone for coming and taking the time out of their Sunday to share in this conversation. It's, these are difficult times. They're trying times in a number of different ways for all of us. The walls are closing in on us, and many of us have suffered loss. And so I just want to thank everyone for taking the time for joining us, and thank you, Sarah, for helping make this possible. Let me just say that the lie is this idea. Well, let me say it differently. The lie is the story we tell ourselves about who we think we are, who we take ourselves to be. I think the through line of American history is predicated or based on what I called in Democracy in Black the value gap, this belief that white people matter more than others. And this belief shapes our dispositions and informs our practices. It shapes our social, political, and economic arrangements. And what the value gap will look like in the context of slavery will look differently in the context of Jim Crow and look differently in the context of the first Black president. And so this idea that white people matter more than others shapes the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. And then we have an architecture of lies to protect that belief and how it evidences itself and organizes the distribution of benefit and burden. So America tells itself this story about itself as an example of democracy achieved, as the shining city on the hill, as the Redeemer Nation, and the like. And it tells itself that story in order to obscure what it has done. So there's a passage on page 9 in Begin Again. And it comes from an essay that Baldwin wrote in 1964 entitled The White Problem. And I think it kind of crystallizes the way in which I'm thinking about the lie, right? So I'm going to read it just for a second, if you indulge me. He says, the people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis of our present trouble, he writes. So the lie we tell about the lie we've told about Black men and women, that about our capacities, our intelligence, our passions, that justify us treating them as chattel, the lie that we've told about America generally and how we have treated those particular bodies, and the lie we tell in order to protect ourselves from reality, which reveals the lies that we've told about those particular people and about the treatment that we have doled out to those particular people. That architecture of lies keeps us in what might very well be described as Never Never Land, a country that refuses to mature, a country, Never Never Land is populated by lost boys and lost girls, right? People who don't want to take responsibility, who don't want to be held accountable. And so in some ways, the lie is the discursive practice that justifies our willful ignorance, right? Our so-called innocence. Is that an answer, Sarah?
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to, hopefully, for people who weren't able to read the book, have that kind of centered around this conversation. So then my follow-up prompt for that and for all of you is, within that context, what is the role of arts, literature, scholarship, activism today, in kind of this age of willful ignorance?
I think it's a powerful question, and it's one of the reasons why I turned to Jimmy in some ways, right? He's a poet in the Emersonian sense of the word, right? And that is that he seeks to take the raw stuff of experience and make of it something that will give us some insight in what it means to be a human being on her way from womb to tomb, right? Emerson, to paraphrase him, would suggest that the poets are the instruments of the gods, right? They give us insight into the complexity of life, right? They give us some particular angle on the world that we inhabit. But also the poet, in the Hebrew sense, coming out of the prophets, right, also aims to make real the suffering, to give voice to that dimension of reality that we turn away from, that we stick our heads in the sand about, So, some of us have to become poets in these times, right? but all of us have to bear witness. Some of us have to figure out how to bring the skill set that we have, whether it's the historian, whether it's the visual artist, whether it's the professor, whether it's the activist. We bring the skill set we have on to bear on reality as it is, right? And then some of us will have to take that skill set and then we shape reality by offering languages for us to make sense of it, right? By offering an account of the experiences, by taking the lived reality in and shaping it in such a way that we can see within the tragedy something beautiful, right? That we can find within those experiences vocabularies to imagine ourselves beyond it. Some of us have to become poets, but all of us have to bear witness. And what does it mean to bear witness, according to Baldwin, coming out of that romantic tradition and that prophetic tradition? It means to make the suffering real, right? Not only to give an account of those who are no longer with us, but those who have survived, but who are broken, you see. And so it seems to me, I turn to Baldwin, not only because I've been reading him for 30 years, but I turn to him because, as he said, that perhaps we could find something in the wreckage, the ruin, and the rubble that could help us make sense of this journey, right? Because I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to push this damn boulder up the hill again, right? I'm trying to muster up the resources to hold off despair, to hold off disillusionment, right? Because white Americans, white folk keep being white folk. And I have to figure out how am I going to survive this, and perhaps generate the energy to imagine democracy otherwise, American democracy otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else want to jump in, respond to that? Yeah, go ahead, Kofi.
Yeah. So speaking from my perspective, and I guess the way that I relate to Baldwin and his understanding of the lie and how the lie affected him in my international experience, sort of gave me the opportunity to escape it. And I know you spoke about that in your book as well. And wow, let me tell you, you really do get a greater understanding of how much of a lie the lie actually is, how much it consumes you, how much it affects your everyday life when you leave the United States. Now, the first time I went to Japan, so first of all, I want to say I recommend that every Black person leave the country for at least 2 weeks.
If you can.
If you can. It's easier than you think. So I was a college dropout with a 1.7 GPA, and I was working a temp job making $10 an hour, and I made it out for a month. It refocuses you. It lets you see a different perspective. And the most important thing to me on the other side of the world, living in Japan, is the American lie had no context, right? So I have white friends who I'm with in Japan, and now they're second-class citizens. And they're struggling to figure out what it's like not to be on top. And people are not examining me as a threat. People are not assuming that I'm unintelligent. And people are just seeing me as a human being. And that was really, I didn't realize how much the white lie, the American lie, affected me. And I was raised by a Black Panther. I remember going to school and my mom telling me, "You think those white kids in your class are smarter than you?" I grew up with that, and the lie still had a hold on me. So I really strongly believe we got to get a perspective outside of the United States before we can do it. That's kind of just, if you can, for a little bit.
When I decided to write this book, I knew I had to leave the country. And my initial idea was to rent a flat in St. Thomas, and just write. And then Hurricane Maria disrupted that. And then I found myself for a month or so in Heidelberg, Germany. And I wasn't in Heidelberg. I write about this in the book. I wasn't in Heidelberg for an hour. and I saw four white police officers with their knees in the back of a black man, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs. And it was at that moment, right, that I got the organizational structure of the book, because I didn't have to run and go on television and talk about it. I didn't have to account for it. I didn't have to look at my son and worry about him, because I was just going back to my flat. And part of what this sometimes we need to get just space to breathe so that we can be. Because people could watch George Floyd get publicly lynched for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. They could clutch their pearls and then move on. But we have to deal with the stress of what that image, that the pornography of our suffering and violence and grief and death, what that means. So when we see the video, then we got to look at our children. Then we got to look at our brothers and sisters. We got to look at family members and friends. We start worrying the stress that comes with having to deal with what Jimmy called those daily cuts, right? The experience of what it means to to live in a society that's constantly devaluing you because it overestimates what the value of whiteness, an interesting source of ways, right? So sometimes you got to find that, what I call in the book, that elsewhere. Some people can make it outside, Kofi. Some people can travel abroad. Some people can't, for a variety of reasons, material constraints and the like. But we still got to find a way to create those spaces so that we can breathe and get the critical distance requisite to say something about this place. Because even in Japan, there's a reason why some of the signage is in English. Even in Japan, we can go to Nagasaki and Hiroshima and still see the imprint of the US empire, right? And so we need to be mindful that even when we try to escape, the tentacles of this empire can still be felt across the board. Sister Evelyn, Dr. Reynolds, yeah.
I think that's greetings. That's sort of the beauty of technology too, is that, you know, we have the ability, if you can't physically travel, then at least now we can connect with people around the world, and we can, you know, form these international relationships. And that's actually something that's centered in a lot of activist circles that I've been a part of, Black activist circles, and historically, you know, the Black Panthers were mentioned, you know, and that was definitely an organization that saw the value in international relationships. But I also appreciate, you know, you mentioning not everyone can do that. And as I was reading your book, I did kind of think about how, you know, there's obviously privilege in being able to just leave the country. Not everyone's able to do that, and that's amazing. And I wish that for everyone, especially every Black person. But I also think about, you know, the folks who were exiled from the United States. And so I was kind of thinking about, you know, the way in which you leave and how that shapes, you know, your sense of self and your analysis of race and Blackness in America. And so I had those thoughts as well as I was reading the book. And those who can't leave, right? Those who are literally stuck here because they can't leave. How does that, you know, kind of shape their consciousness around these topics?
Absolutely. And all of it reveals this kind of uneasy relationship with this place that we call home in some ways. The one thing about Baldwin is that he never really embraced the language of exile. Even though you see in Nobody Knows My Name, he uses exile, but he's constantly interrogating what that word means for him. What he's doing is over and over again is trying to create the requisite distance, what Edward Said would call critical distance, you know, in his books, Representation of Intellectuals, Representation of the Intellectual, right? Trying to figure out how one stands in relation to the metropole, right? Or what Michael Walzer would describe as critical distance as well. And so how do we get the requisite distance from the operations of the American ideology so that we can say something critical about it? And those who have to bear the brunt of US power, right? Whether we're talking about many of those activists, and just above my head, Baldwin is writing in that last novel of all the activists, some of whom were slaughtered, some of whom were thrown in jail, some of whom had to leave, right? Where exile wasn't a matter of choice, It was a matter of necessity, or they would end up being political prisoners. And we don't tend to think about that because of the American ideology and how it frames, the actions of the state in this country. So I think you're absolutely right. The uneasy relationship, the in but not of status. How do we think about this place in all of its complexity? And where do we acquire, from what vantage point can we make that analysis? Can we bring that analysis to bear? Baldwin understood that he had to leave the country in 1948. And he said he could have gone anywhere, although I think he's lying. Right? There's a reason why he ended up in Paris. Richard Wright was in Paris. There's an expat Black American community in Paris. There's a reason why he ended up there. And Baldwin said he had to leave because he knew that the hatred that was in his stepfather was taking root in him. Just down the street here on Route 1 in Princeton, New Jersey, Baldwin was in a restaurant and a white waitress refused to serve him, and he hurled the glass at her head, shattering the window right behind her, shattering the glass behind the head. And then he had to run for his life. And he knew that if he stayed in the country, he was either going to kill somebody or he was going to be killed, because the hatred that was eating up his father was eating him up. And so getting that distance allowed him not to necessarily leave behind the detritus of the American project, but to deal with what was deposited in his gut. And then that became the basis of his criticism. Yes, Brother Erik, how you doing?
Yes, yeah, man, yes. This is a fantastic conversation. And first of all, I want to just commend you and just give some shout outs to just how brilliant your book is. I really enjoyed it. And it's so timely. It is right on time in light of the various things that we are seeing in this country and beyond. If I may, I'd like just to kind of echo what Brother Kofi and Sister Evelyn were talking about, and the importance of understanding the African-American plight in a global context. And I think Baldwin, just as you pointed out, Baldwin in some ways was a kind of consummate global citizen, right? That he understood, or that he, by being overseas, that provided him with another lens to not only critique, but to really interrogate the so-called lie, right? But I wanted just to get back to, or also at the same time, and I think it's important that we understand it, is that, yes, that for many Black folk of color, we don't have the means to travel overseas. But for students or young people that are out there, there are real ways that you can link yourself to the wider world, and that is, of course, you can read newspapers, right, from across the globe, globally. So one of the things I do, like one of the very first things I do when I get up, is I pick up my phone and I look at the Guardian and Al Jazeera, the newspaper from the Persian Gulf, just so I can get a sense of what the world, how it sees global events, how it sees this country, and not through a U.S. lens. But just real quick, because I don't want to talk all day, and this is Brother Eddie's show, but I think just right quick, I mean, for me, I think Baldwin, besides maybe Brother Malcolm, there was nobody who articulated more eloquently the psychoses, the neuroses, the insanity of white supremacy, who understood the perniciousness of white supremacy, its material, psychological, cultural instabilities, as well as, it hasn't been brought up yet, but also Baldwin was groundbreaking in terms of what we now call Black queer theory, Black queer studies, looking at the intersections of gender, sexuality, race. I mean, Giovanni's Room, like one of the first kind of modern queer novels. Another Country, again, all the looking at race, gender, sexuality, intimacy. So I'll stop there, but this is a good conversation. I am definitely digging it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I interviewed Angela Davis for the book, and I just remember we were on Nassau Street, and she said, in so many ways, Jimmy was out there by himself. He was out there all alone. So to follow Go Tell It on the Mountain with Giovanni's Room is just an extraordinary act of will. And for him to say, and it's a book about love. It just happens to be about same-sex love, but it's a book at its heart about love. And he says, you couldn't hold that over me because I told you. There's a way in which his courage, his willingness to be wrong in public, right? So when you read Princes and Powers and Nobody Knows My Name, Baldwin's analysis of the international landscape is flat as wrong as two left feet. Is just flat as all get out. This is the conference where Du Bois couldn't go to because the U.S. has banned him. They're reading Du Bois's letter. Baldwin's critique of negritude is right, but for the most part, his understanding of the geopolitical dynamics of colonialism and decolonization in this moment are really kind of facile. They're not really sophisticated. But by the time we get to the late Jimmy, by the time we get just 3-4 years later, the expansiveness of the mind and the intellect shows him really grappling with the international context. If you watch From Another Place, this extraordinary, beautiful short film by Sadat Peké about Baldwin's time in Istanbul, he wakes up and the first thing you see is him opening the curtains and what is out in the Bosphorus River but U.S. battleships, right? You get a sense of the extension of the scope and expansive nature of U.S. imperial power. So Baldwin understands in interesting sorts of ways this global context, as he's trying in some ways to offer us, I think, the most insightful account of American democracy and race we have. So absolutely, Brother Erik.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
It's not a question per se. We're just talking about the book and the like, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I have a question. Erik brought this up a bit. Baldwin's queerness. You mentioned in your book, Professor Glaude, how he was kind of othered a bit by other leaders of the civil rights movement, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and there were maybe some speculation that they were uncomfortable with that and kind of, were skeptical of him in some ways. And I don't know if we just want to talk about that a little bit more. I found it.
Sure. I mean, one of the things about the book is that I did not center his queerness. And that was a hard decision to make. And in some ways, the decision was in some ways rooted with the very ways in which Baldwin navigated his own queerness, right? And I was trying to be consistent with, because Baldwin is in some ways committed to a very liberal understanding or liberal distinction between private and public. And he's going to insist on some things that he holds dear to him that are private, that's none of your business. But at the same time, there's a way in which Baldwin's prophetic witness is engaged in a queering practice. He queers American politics. He queers Black American politics. And so whenever he shows up, his quote unquote, his misfittedness disturbs the peace in very clear ways. And it does so in ways that I think are very different than, say, Bayard Rustin, right? In very clear way, who was also queer or gay, however we wanted to use the language, right? So there's a sense, I talk about this encounter with Baldwin and King in Disneyland at the Marlon Brando's organized event. And both of them, this is 68, this is a few months before King is assassinated. And Baldwin writes about this in 1972 in No Name in the Street, which is an extraordinary book. I urge all of you to read it. And both of them are engaged in this kind of narration, this narration of the movement, because they know that they're on the precipice of defeat. And they're experiencing in real time the way certain aspects of the movement are being incorporated into a certain American story, a certain kind of reaffirmation of the greatness or the exceptional nature of America. That version of the story is the version that comes out of Barack Obama's mouth, the version that came out during the John Lewis funeral and the like, right? They were trying to resist in real time that co-optation. Baldwin talks about the meeting between the two of them, and he says, you know, they tried to catch up, but, you know, there was this distance. And this distance, I believe, had everything to do with not only Baldwin's sexuality, but also class distinctions. Baldwin's not from Sugar Hill. Baldwin's from the hood, right? And so he's not upper middle class. He's not hanging with Du Bois and Langston Hughes. Baldwin is in the hood with people who are strung out, with hustlers and the like. He comes of age in the hood of Harlem, in the alleys of Greenwich Village, and in the alleys of Paris. So he brings a whole different kind of aesthetic. King is bourgeois Black Atlanta. And those of us who know that, we know what that is. But he's also royalty in terms of the Black preacher class. So Baldwin unsettles. And then when I write about Baldwin's reaction to Eldridge Cleaver, who has all sorts of issues with his own sexuality, with his own sense of desire. That's all we need to do is read Soul on Ice and the violent nature of his sexual desire directed towards white women, and how that gets read, how his misogyny gets read into a certain kind of Black power politics, right? The way in which he reads Jimmy as simply desiring white men, that Jimmy desires to be dominated by white men in effect, right, is in some ways a response to how Jimmy queers the hypermasculinity of Black power politics, you see? So in some ways, Baldwin's misfittedness, to put that in inverted commas, disrupts, right, both phases of the Black freedom struggle in the mid-20th century. Because we tend to think of Eldridge Cleaver and Martin Luther King Jr. as wholly separate moments, but Baldwin's presence shows us that they're not wholly separate moments, that there's this kind of continuous dimension to it all. And he's disrupting both of them by his presence in interesting sorts of ways, right? And, you know, this idea of the hypermasculine male coming in to save the day, right? Oh my God, that's so far from, you know, the very idea of who we take ourselves to be that Jimmy represented, right? I mean, no wonder Baldwin's going to call all of that stuff into question. Plus, he's going to say, you know, Eldridge is already mad at him because he rejects negritude, right? And then he rejects negritude, and that becomes an indication of Baldwin's sense that he's a self-hating Negro. And Baldwin already peeped this now. I know I'm going ahead of it, but Baldwin already peeped that this was going to happen to him. Because if you read, his second piece on Richard Wright, you know, Alas, Poor Richard, and Nobody Knows My Name, he already presupposes that he's going to become the object of the very critique that he delivered on against Richard Wright. He says that's going to happen to him, and lo and behold, it did, right? But the interesting thing is Baldwin also says, you know, don't get caught up in what he called that mystical Black bullshit. Because that for Baldwin releases the trap. And now he's not saying that because he believes in some sentimental idea that we're all just human beings. That's not the point. The point is how these categories grab our ankles or blind us, to use a different kind of metaphor, blind us to the humanity of the human being right in front of us, right? So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Sarah, but it's really important, because if you read the last interview edited by Quincy True, I think it's the second or third interview, someone is trying to get Jimmy to identify with the gay liberation movement in a way that he's uncomfortable with. And in the interview, Baldwin is trying to deconstruct the way the category of gayness is being deployed, just like he does in male prisons, just like he does in Freaks, right? Trying to deconstruct it. And the guy is getting frustrated. Then finally, Jimmy gets, exhausted with the lack of creativity on the part of the interviewer, and just simply thinks in circles around him, because he's worried how the category fixes, right? But at the same time, we got to think about, this didn't make it into the book because we couldn't figure out how to do it narratively, because Audre Lorde handed Jimmy his behind on a platter, right? Trying to show that the very way in which he's thinking about queerness is drenched in certain kind of heteronormative assumptions that he needed to interrogate, right? But that's a whole different question. I'll let Erik jump in there, or some other folks jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong in this regard. Brother Kofi or Paloma, just going on and on.
Actually, I kind of wanted to go off of what you were saying about sort of identity in Baldwin, and how actually something very specific in your book fairly recently, really a liberating concept for me. It's here on page 38 of your book, when you were talking about how the discussion of Black Americans always begins with the deficit.
Oh yeah,
it's powerful to me. If you don't mind me reading it,
please.
There's no need to approach the beauty of Black life as somehow a tangle of pathology or simply a response to the doings of white folk. And that, I read that a bunch of times. I got it underlined. Just sort of reshaping the narrative, and it's about me, and it's not about my, other people's perception of my identity. And just, from reading this, and sort of Baldwin being sort of, unapologetic about every facet of his life, was really, really powerful to me. And it's something that I struggle with, growing up in a white society. I grew up in a mixed neighborhood, being in classes where I was the only Black kid a lot of the time. And this right here is like, I don't gotta apologize for any of that, and I define my own identity. So I appreciate that.
Baldwin had to get to there, though. He had to work his way there. And see, this is a really key point, right? So, it's like thinking about Jimmy, or thinking about Lorraine, or thinking about Richard Wright. Richard Wright, only 8th grade education. So this is extraordinary, an extraordinary act of the will to engage in this kind of self-creation. Baldwin understood what had been deposited in his spirit, in his gut, that he was seeing himself through the eyes of a world that despised him. That's one of the features of double consciousness. What does it mean to see and understand oneself through the eyes of people who degrade and devalue you? And so what's so fascinating about Jimmy is that he's working through that self-hatred in public. So when you read Langston Hughes, or the early Amiri Baraka, or Ishmael Reed, or Eldridge Cleaver, they want to say he's the most self-hating Negro you could ever imagine, because he's too preoccupied with white folk. That's what Langston said about it, right? But there's a revolutionary inversion in Baldwin's corpus that's really important. Folk will read The Fire Next Time, published in 1963. But The Fire Next Time, My Dungeon Shook is prefaced by by an epigraph from Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. And what Baldwin does is he flips it, he inverts it, like a hip hop artist who grabs it and turns it around and breaks it apart, right? What does he do? The problem ain't us. The problem has never been us. The problem isn't with Black and brown folk. The problem isn't with queer folk. The problem ain't us, he argues. I've never been the N-word. The question is, why did you need the N-word in the first place? And until you figure that out, you're going to niggerize other people over and over and over again because you're in need of it. Whether it be the quote unquote illegal alien. What the hell is that phrase? No human being is an illegal alien. I don't know what the hell that means, right? Right, the undocumented worker, the Muslim terrorists, all of these populations are, or as Cornel West would call them, or would say, are niggerized. Why? The problem ain't us, Jimmy says. And so this is the essence of the critique of Native Son. Richard, if I take bigger to be right, I can't account for you. We're not the total result. How can I put this? How can I put this? Let me see if I can put this straightforward. It's not like white folk. We just talking about white folk every day we breathe. It's not like white folk just show up at you go to a cookout in black communities and somebody walk to the black community and just start talking about white people. Like, man, come on, leave that stuff behind. We talk about, when I grew up listening to Al Green and at the fish fry and people drinking brown liquor, we ain't thinking about them folk, right? Right. So part of what Baldwin is trying to say is that there is a richness of black life that isn't reducible to the description of black life as pathology. Imani Perry, my colleague, wrote a brilliant piece distinguishing between blackness and racism. I revel in my blackness, but I hate racism, right? And that's that inversion that Jimmy is trying to get us to see. The problem isn't us, it's actually the other way around. And that frees you up on so many different levels, frees you up. That makes sense, y'all? Or am I just rambling?
No, and just real quick, what you just said, there was a conversation with James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and Lorraine Hansberry, and she said, we don't sit around all day thinking, I am a Negro. Like,
yeah, the snark in that interview is hilarious. Yeah. I was thinking Langston and Jimmy were going to come to blows at some moment, at some point, because they, Jimmy had just written a very nasty review of Langston's poetry, and they were circling around each other, and it has something to do with, I would say this, and I don't want to be crude, but it has something to do with a sense of who was going to be the top dog, a sense of maleness, as it were, in this regard, because they were all, Baldwin, in one of his, I think one of the faults, he's always slaying fathers, right? Right, and it's unnecessary, and it's bothersome at times.
I think it's amazing how James Baldwin's able to cultivate this sort of understanding and analysis and exploration of race in America, of blackness, and all those things, even without a formal education as far as a advanced degree and that sort of thing. So I think for me, I didn't discover Baldwin truly until I went to college. And I'm interested in kind of what Paloma thinks about this too as a college student, but that was kind of the first time that I'd read Baldwin. And I'm just always amazed when I think back on the fact that he was, I guess, cultivated is the best word I can think of right now, through his experiences. And I appreciate that you mentioned his queer identity in your book, because a lot of times folks don't even mention that. They just completely disregard that. I think that's a really important aspect of who he was, and a really important way in which his understanding was informed. He was intersectional before the term intersectional really came about and was popular. He gave that intersectional analysis before, a long time ago. And I think that that's also the value in a lot of, I think we should listen more to trans folks, right? Especially Black trans, who have this analysis that's so brilliant, because they're not so tied and locked into this heteronormative junk that is tied to the lie, right? That heteronormativity is tied to patriarchy, right? Bell Hooks calls it, the white capitalist patriarchy. And so I think that there's that connection too. And for me, as a, I guess, heterosexual person, I do feel like it took me a lot of reading and a lot of studying and reflection and growth to really fully understand things in the way that I do now. And I'm certainly not at my peak of understanding or anything just yet, but I do feel like I've been hindered by the confines of gender. and the confines of all these other sort of binaries that exist. And I think it adds definitely a depth of understanding when you're able to break outside of those molds.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Everybody should be reading Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. What is that? The monstrous nature of the category. What does it mean to stand in that, right? To disrupt the ways in which this stuff works. You know, I think but I think you're absolutely right. I want to hear Paloma. What do you think about reading Baldwin in this moment, in this time? What was your reaction to it at all, in the like?
Well, to first kind of go off of Professor Reynolds' comment about kind of my first introduction to Baldwin, I took a class of hers, and I think the essay, it's been a few years now, the essay was the one about the native son. And that was the first time
Yeah, Notes of the Native Son.
I don't know if I could say that was the first time I heard of Baldwin, but definitely the first time I read of Baldwin. And that kind of reminded me of something that I read, nothing fancy, just on Twitter, but it was someone just tweeted oh, you can tell when a person was kind of radicalized through college or through education, or people who are radicalized just living their daily life. I don't think I would have, sorry, a little nervous. I don't think I could have been introduced into the same kind of critical thought and analyzations without college, basically.
Mm.
So that tweet was, I thought, even though it was only a few sentences, it was very insightful, because even someone's experience of how they're introduced into a topic is so relevant. But I enjoyed the book, and the idea was America is the lie, basically, because the more you read, whether it's Baldwin or Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, then you kind of learn more about the truth.
Yeah.
And everything, all the gray areas in between the truth and the lie.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, one of the things that's so interesting about Baldwin and Ellison and Richard Wright, none of them went to college. I mean, Ellison for a little bit at Tuskegee, but you think about Jimmy and the way in which he, remember, he's the darling of the New York intellectuals, and he's working in a newsroom, and folks are just throwing him books, and he's reviewing those books, right? So there's a kind of intellectual potential that gets nurtured and developed, but he's not constrained by a certain kind of training, right? And he wills himself into becoming this writer, given the conditions out of which he came. I mean, it's an extraordinary act. But I must say that like you, Dr. Reynolds, and Paloma, I didn't come to Baldwin till I read Fire Next Time at Morehouse, but I really wasn't quite into it because I was this Black nationalist. Took my Shahada under H. Rap Brown. I was busy, trying to relive Malcolm's life. That's what this goatee is all about, and I didn't really encounter him until graduate school. And I was afraid of him because I knew what he was going to do to me. So when I talk about this in the book really quickly, right? So when I read, I was attracted to Ellison because Ralph Ellison had this cool pose. I loved his nonfiction, Shadow and Act and Going to the Territory. It was a kind of literary sophistication. There was philosophical moves behind it. I could read Kenneth Burke and see what Ellison was doing with Burke. His mask fit perfectly. And then when I read him with my white colleagues, I didn't have to deal with him because he didn't make my white colleagues uncomfortable. But when we read Baldwin, the ground was just scorched. I had to deal with red cheeks, and I had to deal with all of this other. And then Baldwin threw me back on myself because he holds the view that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that Socratic dictum is going to make itself known that if you're going to read him, he's going to force you back onto yourself. And then not only, in order for me to talk about America's lives, I had to deal with the scaffolding of my own lives. Because the messiness of the country is actually a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so that encounter, so I didn't really get going until the last year of my graduate career. And then I've been teaching him ever since. But I was walking around him carefully because I knew what he was going to do. Erik, you want to say something? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, man, this is great. And, time is short here. So I'll keep my question really succinct. Something that really caught my attention about your book is how much it's informed by the current moment, by Black Lives Matter. That powerful, painful anecdote that you share in Germany, seeing, the brother getting beat up by the police. How would you rewrite this book today in light of COVID, in light of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, the mass protests that we've seen across the country and globally? Certainly, again, Black Lives Matter very much informs your book. But I'm curious to know, again, just how, just how this current moment where Black, Brown, Native folks are being decimated, right, by this virus. So please, thoughts or comments, please.
I wrote the book really for all of those young folk who risked everything in 2014. Right, because the idea was, in the beginning of the book, I talk about Jimmy chopping it up with those Howard students into the sunrises, right, and telling them I'll never betray you, and that it was an act of love, knowing that Stokely and Cortland and Muriel Tillinghast and all of those young folk would just 2 years later would be screaming, 2-3 years later would be screaming Black Power. Because Baldwin knew what was on the horizon, but he never betrayed him. And so what I was thinking when I was writing the book was, what happened to those activists who were all out there, who put everything on the line in 2014 and 15, who were willing to confront the militarized police in cities across this country. And then they had to sit back and watch the country not just bank-right, but as I've been saying, bomb it up Donald Trump. And how might they find the resources to keep struggling? Now, what this moment revealed for me is that they were struggling all along. The cameras might not have been there, but they have been continuing to do this work on the ground. People think defund the police just showed up in a rally. That's been around for a minute. Right, folk, what we're seeing is the actual culmination of organizing, right? So I thought I was writing something to them, when in fact, they have revealed something to me about the nature of struggle, about the limits of this camera, right? Of what it means to be steady and true and consistent in one's pursuit of this new Jerusalem, of this more just world, right? So I wouldn't change the particulars, because in some ways the general description is like spot on, I think. But then there's COVID. And I honestly believe, and I know time is running short, COVID is going to be like BC AD. It's going to change our periodization. There's going to be America before COVID and America after COVID. And so what COVID has revealed, how can I put it? It's like when they shoot that dye in you to see where the sickness is, right? that purple dye is everywhere. And we see all of the areas of sickness in the body politic. So America is fundamentally broken. It is broken in a number of different ways. And we are about to experience something in November that we've never experienced before. If he wins, all hell will break loose. If he loses, all hell is going to break loose. And what we're going to, so I think I would have had to write at the end about that. Because November, buckle up. Because we've never experienced, I've never ever in my lifetime had to ask myself the question, will there be the peaceful transition of power? So whether he wins or whether he loses, buckle up.
I also
Hi,
have
Paloma.
a question.
Sure, sure.
I guess, how do you think that this book would have been different, I guess, if, let's say, like, Trump wasn't president, I guess, and he still wanted to talk about the topics of race and the lie of America, and I guess my question is, because you mentioned Trump like a couple times, and definitely, I mean, that's very relevant, Trump as our president, but I guess I wonder what you would write differently about the same topics if, I guess, someone that we see like Trump is kind of like has opened up like all of our eyes kind of thing, if he wasn't president or in his position of power.
Paloma, that's a great question. You know, I got in a lot of trouble because in 2016, I wrote a book entitled Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. And I called President Obama a confidence man, from Melville, confidence man, selling the snake oil of hope and change. So I actually used the concept of the value, I introduced the concept of the value gap in that book. And then this book is actually a companion, is a follow-up to that book. Jimmy was all over Democracy in Black. He was just backstage screaming, you know, stage instructions, right? Telling me where to go, where to go. No, this is line. That's what Jimmy was doing in the background of Democracy in Black. And so he just came on stage, you know, and begin again. So part of what I was trying to do in 2016 was to say, look, Black America is suffering. That the value gap still obtains even with this black man in the White House. How do we reimagine Black politics? How do we get to this way of addressing how the value gap and racial habits and white fear overdetermine our politics? And that's without Trump. And then the country vomited up Donald Trump. Now, what do I mean? There are moments in which the country faces a kind of reckoning where it has an opportunity to be otherwise. It's a moment of transition where an old world is dying and the possibility of a new America can come into being. And I note two moments, two historical precedents or coordinates. One is radical Reconstruction, right? That's when they call it the second founding. You know, a notion of American citizenship untethered from race, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments passed, a notion of the federal powers expanded, right? What do we get in response to radical Reconstruction? We get Jim Crow, racial apartheid in the South. We get convict leasing. That's how cities like Birmingham get built. We get the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism, which defines America's imperial ambition. So we need to be clear, it's not just simply this bad region of the South that never gets itself together, right? So most of the Confederate statues are built in place between this period. We double down on our ugliness. That's one coordinate. The other coordinate is the mid-20th century, the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. And what do we get in response? We get the response of the call for law and order. Not just simply the election of Richard Nixon, but we see, hidden in the Kerner Commission report, We see in Lyndon Baines Johnson's, Elizabeth Hinton has written about this. Naomi Murakawa has written about this, right? How liberals helped build prison America. The cornerstone of the carceral state placed right during this period as a reaction to it. What else do we get? We get the tax revolt in California, right? Which led to the erosion of the social safety net, which was at the heart of the New Deal. Hard Hat Revolution or rebellion, the forgotten American, the silent majority. In this moment where the country had a chance to choose to be otherwise, it doubled down on this ugliness, on this belief that America is a white nation where the value gap must obtain. We elect Barack Obama. Everyone says the country has changed. I'm screaming, no, no, no. And then what do we get in response? We get the vitriol of the Tea Party. We get voter ID laws and voter suppression laws. And we get the election of Donald J. Trump. At a moment where we have an opportunity to change, we double down on our ugliness. And so we're in the midst of those after times. We're experiencing that moral reckoning. So the short answer to your question is the last book was written about exactly what you're asking about. This book is me trying to think about it a little bit more carefully in this moment. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, that was a great question. It is 5 o'clock. So this has been a really wonderful conversation. I want to thank Professor Glaude and all of the panelists, Kofi, Paloma, Dr. McDuffie, and Dr. Reynolds. This has been—
I talk too much. I'm sorry.
No, it was wonderful. We do have we want to be mindful of your time, obviously.
Oh, sure. No, we're good. We're good.
And all of you. Yeah, we do have the Zoom call until 5:30. If any of you have to go, you're welcome to. If anyone wants to stay on, we have a lot of questions from people in the audience.
So let's take a couple of questions. I want to be mindful of the panelist time because it is Sunday after all.
Right.
And folk need to do their thing because I, as my mother says, I was born to push a pencil and run my mouth. So I want to be mindful of their time. But let's deal with a couple of questions from some of the folk out there.
Yeah. So one of them, and I think all of you can address this. It says, Dr. Glaude, would you say more about being forced back onto yourself and the necessity of self-reflection when working with authors like Baldwin?
Well, I barely survived writing this book. Every time I found myself at the computer, or I tend to handwrite, I'm old school, there was a glass of Jameson right next to me, right? And I think it has something to do with the fact that, like I said, in order to get the emotion on the page, to kind of write, to take the risk to write like I wrote, like the book is written, because I haven't produced a book like this before. I had to deal with the fact that I'm a vulnerable little boy. I had to deal with my daddy issues. I had to grapple with this man who's so important to who I am, but who deposited fear in my gut from when I was a little boy. And I've been trying to prove that I'm not scared ever since. And so in order to get to those sentences, right, in order to bear witness and to strive to be a poet, I had to do some things. I had to go to some places that I haven't gone before in the writing. Jimmy helped me go there. He forced me to go there. And I'm thankful for it.
Anyone else want to talk about self-reflection?
Yeah, so, well, not just from James Baldwin, but also from reading, and I've been watching a lot of Dr. Glaude for the past couple of weeks also.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of you. Divorcing myself from the lie has proved to be very difficult and it's in stages. Like, I think that I've escaped it, and then I realize that I haven't yet. And one of the things that I've thought fairly recently is how much power and authority I attribute to white voices just because a white person said it. And I've been trying to be more mindful of that. So for me, that self-reflection is really understand, like, the lie is in there. I've known about it for years, but I'm still working with that. And I think it really takes active self-reflection. I don't remember if you said this in an interview, but you said something about practicing freedom.
Oh, yeah.
And like, I think it's practice, not having it or not having it, but yeah, I just think fighting against the lie is an ongoing practice. So yeah, that's for me.
Freedom is not an end. Freedom is a practice. We need to understand that. Yeah. And let me just say this really quickly. We have to make a distinction. Baldwin makes this distinction in The Evidence of Things Not Seen. And it's an important distinction. And it's a distinction between white people and people who happen to be white. And that's really important, because I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white. And then they're white people. And what does he mean by that? Right? Those who happen to be white are those who are engaged in this ongoing work of deconstructing the value gap, of understanding how the language of racism comes to them as natural as language itself, right? Who are trying to, in some ways, understand the ways in which they're implicated in this system, right? In the structures that we're describing. There's a wonderful book, little book written by Wendell Berry entitled The Hidden Wound that I think everyone should read, where Wendell Berry, this Kentucky-bred dude, is trying to figure out how this stuff is moving him about. There's a kind of an awareness of it all. And then there are those folk who are just simply invested in the idea that white people ought to matter more than others. They're invested in whiteness determining the distribution of advantage and disadvantage, right? And so we have to engage in the choice. Right? Where are you going to sit? What kind of work are you going to choose to do, right? And so when I need to say that when I'm saying white people, I'm thinking about a particular technical formulation here, right? And I understand I'm talking at the level of generality, but it's a certain kind of generality that I'm trying to reach for in this moment. Can we take a couple of more, just two more, Sarah, and then we can let everybody go eat their dinner?
Yes. So the next one, what do you recommend for the young generation right now, the ones who want a better and a new America?
I can't answer, so some other folk can answer that one, right? Professor Reynolds? Paloma?
That is a good question.
I'm sorry, what was the question? What can you recommend?
Yeah, what do you recommend for the young generation right now, the ones who want a better and new America?
I think I would say I definitely don't have the, this is the answer, but I have some ideas. And kind of going back to what you all were saying about, kind of yourself being thrown at you as you read certain things, and this kind of unraveling of like who you are and understanding yourself better through different experiences and things like that. I always say that as far as, when this sort of question comes up, is that I think we really, of course, there's a lot of external things that we need to deal with, but we do have to deal with ourselves and our own biases, our own issues, the ways that we cling to oppressive systems, the ways that we cling to the lie, and really sort of, try to dismantle that in ourselves. And I was thinking, in this conversation of freedom, and Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. Recently, I was reading Sekou Odinga, and he said, we need a cultural revolution to understand what freedom means. And I think, as we're having these conversations about how we move forward and what the next steps are, and this is the time to have those conversations, to dream about the world that we want and what freedom means. I think it's just worth kind of reflecting on those things and some internal work that we can do as individuals to kind of change our culture while we change the structures in our society as well. So for me personally, that's definitely something that I deal with on my own, and also something that I talk to students and other young folks about too, because we are so focused sometimes on the external. We forget that there's individuals that operate these oppressive institutions in our society, and many of them aren't white too, right? So that's my piece.
Yeah, I guess mine would be, even as Eddie was talking, that even as a person of color, being a non-Black person of color, you still benefit off of the same systems of oppression that affect Black people every day. So definitely a lot of internal work. So anti-Blackness, that's a lot of. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's often an equation of I don't know, Latinx struggle and like Black struggle, but it's not the same. Personally, that's what I have seen, especially in terms of just like working together, which there's no problem with working together. But I think what is often erased or ignored is how Latinx is as a community, and any non-Black person of color can contribute to further oppression without that internal work, individually and community-wise.
Absolutely. I would insist on developing your bibliography. You hear me?
Yeah.
That is to say, we gotta, if Baldwin, high school educated, right, reading all the time, shaping his vision, right, we tend, I understand the importance of experience, but we have to continue to expand our vocabulary to describe what we're experiencing, what we're trying to account for, to give an account of what we're living. So the advice I would give to young folk is to begin to continue to develop your bibliography. That is, get your reading done. Understand as best you can the world that you inhabit, because it wasn't created out of nothing, right? And I think that's really important. Eric, you were gonna say something that.
Well, I guess you and me, brother Eddie, are the old heads here now. So, but just in terms of books, books to read, I would suggest for folks out there, especially young people, this absolutely brilliant novel by James Baldwin, Another Country. It's probably one of the best books I've ever read. But just very briefly going back to what Sister Paloma was saying, thinking about feminists of color, Angela Davis, and others, this concept of politics of solidarity, right? So it's not about who we are per se, but of course being very mindful of our own social locations, but it's about a shared vision of justice and freedom. Imagining a world based upon the freedom, justice, love, humanity that can transcend those various social locations. So again, folks like Baldwin, folks like Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, those folks are still, or not still, are very much on at the top of my reading list, and I think those are great places to start.
Absolutely.
I just like to add, make friends with people who don't look like you. Actually, I think it's simple, but I think that's really important. And just try to get outside of your comfort zone. Like Maya Angelou said, the most important value is courage that comes before all others. Getting yourself out there, and a part of that is reading literature from a subject that maybe your parents never introduced you to. And just making friends with people. I think that's at the basis, that's all it is. And recognizing that, skin, hair, and eye color, it's a concept. We're all the same thing.
That's great. Okay, last question. This one is, a lot of these are directed at Professor Glaude, but I think all of you can probably speak to this. It says, Dr. Glaude, your authenticity and honesty about your own journey writing this book is so inspirational and freeing. How to help the white people who are now asking me how to help, what to do, without being so naked and vulnerable myself.
Don't let folk turn you into a missionary. what can I do? Right? That question, whatever that question is asked to me, you just kind of say, well, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to tell you what to do in this moment? What does that mean in its details, right? Oftentimes that question emanates from a decent place, but it's also an attempt to assuage one's conscience about one's relative silence up to that moment, you see. And so part of what we have to do is kind of first disrupt the frame that racial equality and racial justice is not a philanthropic enterprise, that this is not about charity, right? This is not you asking me how much can I give, and then I give you a number and then you write your check. That's not the point. The point is, what is your understanding of a more just world? What can I do? Well, if you have an understanding of what is a more just world, then we already have the elements of the answer to the question. Should you engage in work around the living wage, that people who are working 40 hours a week should be able to not only put food on the table, but keep a roof over their heads and imagine a better future for their children? Could you think that America, supposedly a democracy, should be able to educate all of its children? So that means that we need to invest in public education where your zip code doesn't determine your color, your zip code doesn't determine the quality of education you receive, so that our children could dream dreams and not only acquire the skills to make those dreams a reality. What do I do? What is your conception of a more just world? And let's begin to think about where you sit and where you stand right now, what you can do right in front of you to make that more just world happen. Baldwin was very clear. I'm skeptical of liberals. I'm skeptical of white liberals. Why did Jimmy say that? He was sitting right next to Betty Shabazz. He said it because I'm skeptical of people who want to do something for me as opposed to something with me. I'm not an object of charity, right? And I also am not an object to assuage your guilt. So if we're going to get about this work honestly, right? What is your conception of a more just world? Let's get about doing that work, right? If you think that the form of policing that resulted in the public lynching of George Floyd is wrong, let's change the form of policing. Let's reimagine the very nature of public safety, right? Don't get scared when we get to that debate. But if it's really about assuaging your guilt, ask somebody else that question. Does that make sense? Because let me say it this way. This is what I'm trying to suggest in this moment. We have to stop dancing. We have to stop participating in this theater where we end up just tinkering around the edges and somebody else has to bury their loved one. And then we have to consume the pornography of Black grief, suffering, and death again. So stop dancing. I'm tired of the pearl clutching. What is your conception of a more just world? Join with us and let's build it. Let's stop playing. As Jimmy says, whenever you hear the question, what else does the Negro want? The alarm flag should go up immediately. Because you know what we want. You know what kind of world we want. We want a more just world. Let's make it happen.
It's wonderful. I want to give anyone else the chance to chime in before we turn this off.
Well, just I think the best way to examine that question, what should white people do when they ask us that, is it's so hard to answer because it's not a good question. It's a ridiculous question. We don't have to answer that anymore. It's not our responsibility. And Dr. Glaude talks about that in his book. And that was another, thank you, by the way, that was an extremely liberating concept. It freed up so much of my time. It really did.
So this is the view, Kofi, because I think you hit it right on the head. I said the idea of white America is irredeemable. There's nothing about that idea that is salvageable. And what do I mean by that? Any idea that believes that because you're white, you are valued more than others, there's nothing you can do with that. But it doesn't mean that we are irredeemable. The idea of white America is irredeemable. That doesn't mean that we are irredeemable. That's the first claim. The second claim, so much of our time has been spent trying to convince racist people not to be racist. So much of our time is spent trying to convince the Trump supporter not to support him. Civic energy is finite. I don't want to spend my time that way. I want to spend my time working with you to build a world where those views have no quarter to breathe. I think it's better spent if you and I are working together, the relatively few conscious, like lovers, risking everything to build a new Jerusalem where those views can't find any space to breathe. That seems to me to be easier. Well, it's not easier, it's better spent.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you for staying an extra 20 minutes. Also, this has been a really fantastic discussion. You all brought so much to the table. And thank you, Urbana Free Library again, and James Baldwin for bringing us all together, and Dr. Glaude especially for writing this incredible book that you all got to read.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. And stay safe.
Thank
Please,
you so much.
stay safe.
Thank you
Y'all
very
in
much.
my prayers. Take care now.
Very much. Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye.